Ella es Hasley.
Weigel, padre.
¿Quién es?
Luke Holland. Música.
Quería conocer tu mundo.
Este no es mi mundo.
¿Cómo es eso?
Me hace volar. Te mereces ser feliz.
No voy a dejarte solo.
Boulevard is a 2026 Spanish romantic drama directed by Sonia Mendez and written by Javier Ruscas, based on Flor M. Salvador's novel of the same name, which originally gained popularity through Wattpad before being published by Penguin Random House. The film was produced by Spotlight Media, Madam Indu Azinma, Amit's Kalia 8IE and Lightbox Animation Studios, with Sony Pictures Entertainment Iberia and Webtoon Productions associated with the production. The film was shot in Biscay, Spain, and its original language is Spanish. According to Spain's official ICAA film database, Boulevard was produced in 2026, runs for 113 minutes, is classified as a romantic drama, and received its Spanish theatrical release on April 10, 2026. The same official Spanish record reports 119,194 admissions and €852,018.98 in Spanish box office revenue, while international box office databases report a worldwide theatrical gross of approximately $3.63 million, including about $3.61 million internationally and $13,853 from its limited U.S. theatrical release. The reported worldwide figure should be understood as the theatrical gross currently recorded by box office databases rather than a statement about the film's total lifetime revenue from every possible source. A definitive official production budget is not clearly published in the principal public film records, so it would be inaccurate to present an unverified figure as an official budget. The film's financial performance can therefore be discussed confidently through its recorded box office, but its exact production cost should be treated as unconfirmed. With that financial and production background established, Boulevard becomes much more interesting when viewed not simply as another young adult romance but as a story about two emotionally troubled young people who discover a connection at a moment when neither of them is completely prepared for what that connection will demand. The story follows Hasley Weigel, played by Eve Ryan, a young woman whose life is unsettled by personal struggles, unfulfilled ambitions and an increasingly complicated emotional state, after she moves to a new city with her mother. Her arrival places her in an unfamiliar environment where she is forced to rebuild parts of her everyday life, but the most important change comes when she encounters Luke Howland, played by Mikel Niso. Luke immediately carries an aura of danger and emotional distance. He is the kind of person other people seem to have already judged before understanding him, and the warnings surrounding him become one of the first barriers between him and Hasley. Yet the central attraction of Boulevard is built precisely on the fact that Hasley does not simply accept the version of Luke that everyone else has created. She becomes curious about the person underneath the reputation, and that curiosity gradually becomes emotional attachment. What initially looks like a conventional good girl and dangerous boy romance becomes more complicated because neither Hasley nor Luke enters the relationship as a blank slate. Both characters carry problems into the relationship, and the film repeatedly explores whether two people can become a source of comfort for each other without turning that comfort into unhealthy dependence. This is where Boulevard establishes its most important theme: love can give people hope, but love is not the same thing as healing. Hasley sees Luke's vulnerability and wants to understand him. Luke discovers in Hasley someone who is willing to look beyond his reputation and confront the pain hidden beneath his behavior. Their attraction therefore comes from more than physical chemistry. They recognize loneliness in one another. They recognize the feeling of being misunderstood. They recognize the desire to have at least one person who sees the private version of them that the rest of the world never gets to see. That emotional recognition is the foundation of their relationship, and it is also the source of its danger. When two people are already struggling, it can be extremely powerful to find another person who understands those struggles, but it can also become tempting to make that person responsible for fixing everything. Boulevard understands this contradiction and uses it to drive the emotional development of its central characters. Hasley is not simply a girl who falls in love with Luke and suddenly becomes happy. Her personal problems do not disappear because she meets him. Her emotional difficulties continue to influence her choices, and the film's portrayal of addiction is particularly important because it prevents the romance from becoming a simple cure-all fantasy. Luke also carries a complicated history that shapes the way he behaves. His darkness is not presented as a superficial personality trait designed only to make him attractive. The story gives him emotional wounds and a tragic past, and these elements explain why he is so difficult to understand. But explaining a character's pain is not the same as excusing every decision that character makes, and this distinction is essential to understanding Boulevard. Luke can be sympathetic without being perfect. He can be wounded without being harmless. He can love Hasley sincerely while still behaving in ways that create problems for their relationship. That contradiction makes him more interesting than a conventional romantic hero. Mikel Niso's performance has to carry much of this complexity because Luke spends a significant part of the story communicating through guarded behavior rather than direct explanations. The character's silence, unpredictability and emotional distance are part of his identity, but the film gradually reveals the vulnerability beneath them. Eve Ryan faces a different challenge with Hasley because the character must be more than the audience's window into Luke's life. Hasley needs her own emotional identity, and the movie works best when it allows her to exist independently of the romance. Her dreams, insecurities, relationships and personal problems make her more than a romantic prize. The fact that she is also struggling means that her attraction to Luke becomes understandable without becoming completely idealized. She is not simply attracted to danger, she is attracted to someone who makes her feel seen. That distinction is crucial. Boulevard's romance works because Hasley and Luke discover a private emotional language that makes them feel less alone. Their connection becomes a kind of refuge. The title Boulevard can therefore be interpreted symbolically as well as literally. A boulevard is a road, a place of movement, a space between destinations, and that makes it an appropriate metaphor for the relationship. Hasley and Luke are both in transitional stages of their lives. Neither has completely figured out who they are or where they are going. Their relationship becomes a temporary place where they can stop running from their problems and simply be together. But a road is never a permanent destination. Eventually, people have to continue moving, and Boulevard uses that idea to emphasize the temporary nature of emotional escape. The central relationship offers Hasley and Luke moments of freedom, but it cannot permanently isolate them from their pasts. Family, addiction, trauma, friendship, social pressure and personal responsibility continue to exist outside the relationship. This is one of the reasons the film should not be understood as a straightforward fantasy about love conquering everything. Its emotional question is more complicated. Can love survive when the people involved are still fighting themselves? That question gives the story a level of seriousness beneath its familiar romantic structure. The screenplay has the difficult task of adapting a popular Wattpad novel into a feature-length cinematic experience. Wattpad stories often build their appeal through intimate narration, direct access to character thoughts and long-form emotional development. A film cannot reproduce that exact experience. It has to transform internal feelings into performances, dialogue, visual language, music, editing and physical environments. Boulevard's success therefore depends heavily on whether the audience can feel what the characters are feeling without needing every emotion to be explained verbally. The film's structure is relatively straightforward. A new girl arrives, she encounters a troubled young man, attraction develops despite warnings, their relationship becomes increasingly intense, and the personal problems surrounding them begin to threaten the emotional world they have created. But the simplicity of that structure allows the film to focus on character emotion rather than complicated plot mechanics. Sonia Mendes's direction keeps the story centered on the young characters and the spaces they inhabit. The school environment, family spaces and streets of their community become more than background because the emotional meaning of those places changes depending on what Hasley and Luke are experiencing. This is particularly effective in a coming-of-age story because adolescence often transforms ordinary locations into emotionally significant spaces. A school hallway can become the place where someone first realizes they are in love. A street can become associated with a major memory. A private meeting place can become a refuge from family pressure and social expectations. Boulevard uses that kind of emotional geography to make the relationship feel larger than the plot itself. The film also benefits from the contrast between the public and private versions of its characters. In public, Luke has a reputation. In private, Hasley sees another side of him. In public, Hasley has to deal with expectations from family and friends. In private, she can admit things she cannot easily express elsewhere. This contrast creates one of the film's strongest dramatic mechanisms because the audience understands that the relationship is built around secrets and vulnerability. The more important the private world becomes, the more threatening the outside world feels. That is also where the film begins to explore emotional dependency. When one person becomes the only place where another person feels understood, losing that person can begin to feel impossible. The relationship stops being simply about love and becomes about emotional survival. Boulevard repeatedly approaches that territory, especially through Luke's psychological struggles and Hasley's own difficulties. This is where the film becomes more mature than its basic romantic premise might suggest. It recognizes that a relationship can be sincere and still be unhealthy. It recognizes that two people can genuinely care about each other while also making each other's problems more difficult. It recognizes that attraction and compatibility are not always the same thing. These are important ideas because the film's central romance is intentionally intense. Hasley and Luke do not experience their relationship casually. Their feelings become central to their identities, and that intensity makes every conflict more significant. The film's romantic atmosphere therefore depends heavily on chemistry between the two leads. If the audience believes that Hasley and Luke genuinely need each other, their emotional journey becomes compelling. If that chemistry does not work for the viewer, many of the film's romantic scenes can instead feel familiar or overly dramatic. This explains why Boulevard has received mixed reactions. Some viewers connect with the emotional story and the performances, while some critics have argued that the movie relies too heavily on familiar young adult romance conventions, including the troubled boy dynamic, heightened dialogue and dramatic relationship conflicts. That criticism is worth considering because the film is clearly working within a genre with recognizable patterns. The "good girl falls for damaged bad boy" structure has been used many times, and Boulevard does not completely escape that tradition. But the existence of familiar elements does not automatically make a film ineffective. The real issue is whether the characters are developed enough to give those familiar elements emotional meaning. Boulevard's strongest defense against cliché is its attempt to make both central characters flawed. Hasley is not completely innocent, and Luke is not simply a misunderstood prince waiting for the right girl to save him. Both have problems. Both make mistakes. Both need to take responsibility for themselves. That makes the relationship more complicated than a simple fantasy. Another important aspect of the movie is the supporting cast. Characters such as Matt, Olivia, Niso, Carla, Andre, Zev, Dylan, Cole Howland, Bonnie Weigel and members of Luke's family create the social and family environment around the central couple. Beal Anton plays Matt, while Ainara Helguera plays Olivia. Enzo Oliver plays Niso, Najwa Kliwa plays Carla, Christian Cheka plays Andre, John Lucas plays Zev, Brian Vilch plays Dylan, Pepe Barroso plays Cole Howland, Esther Aceba plays Bonnie Weigel and Luis Zahera plays Luke's father. These characters matter because Hasley and Luke do not exist in isolation. Their relationship affects friendships, family relationships and social dynamics. Matt in particular creates an important contrast because he represents another possible emotional direction for Hasley. Luke is intense, unpredictable and emotionally damaged, while Matt provides a different kind of relationship possibility. The contrast creates a familiar romantic triangle, but the underlying question is more interesting than simply asking which boy Hasley should choose. The deeper issue is what kind of relationship Hasley actually needs. Does emotional intensity automatically mean a stronger connection? Does stability automatically mean a healthier relationship? Can a person distinguish between being deeply attracted to someone and being genuinely compatible with them? Boulevard uses the romantic triangle to explore these questions, even if some of its execution remains within familiar genre conventions. The film's treatment of friendship is also significant because friendships can provide an alternative form of emotional support. When a romantic relationship becomes the only source of comfort, characters can become isolated from the people who might otherwise help them. Boulevard therefore benefits when its supporting characters remind the audience that Hasley and Luke have lives outside their romance. That broader social environment makes the central relationship feel more realistic because real emotional problems rarely exist inside a vacuum. Families have opinions. Friends react. Teachers notice changes. Communities create reputations. People carry memories. All of those factors place pressure on the central couple. Another major theme is the difference between understanding and responsibility. Hasley's ability to understand Luke is one of the reasons she falls in love with him, but understanding someone does not mean accepting every behavior. The film invites viewers to feel sympathy for Luke without necessarily asking them to approve of everything he does. That distinction is especially important because romantic fiction can sometimes romanticize destructive behavior by presenting it as evidence of emotional depth. Boulevard occasionally comes close to that danger because Luke's pain is part of his appeal, but the broader story also suggests that pain cannot become an excuse for refusing to change. This creates an important tension between romantic fantasy and psychological realism. In romantic fantasy, the damaged person becomes better because someone finally loves them. In psychological reality, love may motivate change, but change requires personal effort. Boulevard's most valuable idea is that Hasley cannot simply save Luke, and Luke cannot simply save Hasley. They can support each other, but neither can take responsibility for the other person's entire life. This is especially important in the context of addiction. The film does not treat addiction as a glamorous character trait. It is one of the factors that complicates Hasley's emotional life and her relationship with Luke. Addiction affects decision-making, self-perception and relationships, and by including it in the story, Boulevard moves beyond a simple romance narrative into more difficult emotional territory. The film's treatment is not necessarily as deep or clinically detailed as a dedicated addiction drama would be, but its presence changes the meaning of the romance. Hasley's problems cannot simply disappear because Luke loves her. Similarly, Luke's emotional trauma cannot be erased because Hasley understands him. This is where the movie's central message becomes increasingly clear. Love can create a reason to fight, but it cannot do the fighting for you. The same principle applies to family relationships. Hasley's relationship with her mother becomes part of the emotional background of her new life, while Luke's family history helps explain his psychological condition. The contrast between the two families creates another layer of the story. Hasley is trying to adapt to change, while Luke is living with the consequences of a past that continues to affect his present. Their relationship therefore brings together two different kinds of instability. Hasley is moving into a new chapter. Luke is struggling to escape an old one. That difference creates both attraction and conflict. Hasley represents possibility to Luke. Luke represents intensity and emotional recognition to Hasley. But neither character is necessarily prepared for the consequences of becoming central to another person's emotional life. This is why the film's romantic moments are often more meaningful when viewed through the lens of vulnerability rather than simple attraction. The most important question is not whether Hasley thinks Luke is attractive or whether Luke cares about Hasley. The important question is why they feel safer with each other than they feel with almost anyone else. Their relationship gives them permission to be imperfect. That is powerful because both characters spend much of their lives trying to hide their imperfections from other people. The Boulevard becomes the place where they can stop performing. Yet that freedom is fragile. Once the outside world begins to interfere, they have to decide whether their connection is strong enough to exist outside that private space. The film's visual storytelling supports this emotional structure. Cinematographer Lucia C. Pan helps create a cinematic environment in which the characters' private moments can feel distinct from their public lives. The film does not need massive spectacle because its drama is primarily interpersonal. Its visual language is therefore more useful when it emphasizes faces, environments, distance between characters and the emotional atmosphere of particular locations. Music also plays an important role in romantic dramas because it can communicate emotions that dialogue cannot fully express. Beatriz Lopez Nogales provides the score, and the musical atmosphere helps support the film's movement between intimacy, uncertainty and emotional conflict. Editing by Roddy McDonald contributes to the rhythm of the relationship, especially as the story moves between quieter character moments and more dramatic developments. Production design by Ana Paula Martin and costume work by Nazariya Kalamina further establish the world in which the characters live. These technical elements may not be the primary reason audiences come to Boulevard, but they are important because romantic dramas depend heavily on atmosphere. The film has to create a believable emotional world in which the central relationship feels important. Without atmosphere, the romance can feel artificial. With the right atmosphere, even familiar scenes can gain emotional weight. The adaptation itself is also significant because Boulevard comes from a novel that developed a substantial online audience. This means many viewers approach the movie with pre-existing expectations. Readers already have images of Hasley and Luke in their minds. They already know the emotional tone of the story. They may have strong opinions about which scenes matter and how the characters should behave. That creates a difficult situation for the filmmakers. If the movie changes too much, existing fans may complain that the adaptation is not faithful. If it changes too little, critics may accuse it of simply reproducing the conventions of the original material without taking advantage of cinema as a medium. Boulevard therefore exists between two audiences: people who already love the story and people discovering it for the first time. For fans, seeing Hasley and Luke become physical characters can be emotionally meaningful because the film transforms an imagined relationship into a visual one. For newcomers, the movie has to stand on its own without relying on knowledge of the novel. This difference in audience expectations may explain why reactions can be so divided. A viewer who already has an emotional connection to the characters may forgive or even enjoy elements that a completely new viewer finds predictable. At the same time, the film's basic story is accessible enough that someone unfamiliar with the novel can understand the central conflict. Boulevard's biggest strength is therefore not originality of premise but emotional accessibility. It knows what kind of story it wants to tell. It is a romantic drama about young people who feel isolated, discover each other and then discover that love does not automatically eliminate their problems. The film's biggest weakness is that it sometimes expresses those ideas through conventions that audiences have already seen many times. The dialogue can occasionally feel designed to underline emotions that the performances might have been capable of communicating on their own. The relationship can also move toward melodrama because the genre expects heightened emotion. But melodrama is not automatically a flaw. Melodrama can be powerful when it is sincere. The problem arises only when the audience stops believing in the characters and starts seeing the machinery of the plot. Boulevard is most effective when it trusts Hasley and Luke to communicate through behavior, silence and small gestures rather than constantly explaining their feelings. The emotional core of the film ultimately comes down to a simple but painful truth. Sometimes the person who understands your pain is not necessarily the person who can heal it. Hasley and Luke find something rare in each other, but rarity does not guarantee permanence. Their relationship is meaningful precisely because it gives them a place to confront parts of themselves that they normally hide. The romance is therefore less about two perfect people finding each other and more about two imperfect people discovering what it means to be seen. That makes the story emotionally accessible even when its structure remains familiar. Hasley's journey is about more than falling in love. It is about learning that she cannot define herself entirely through another person. Luke's journey is about more than being loved. It is about confronting the fact that his past cannot be erased simply because someone sees the good in him. Their relationship gives both characters hope, but the film constantly reminds us that hope has to become action if anything is going to change. This is where Boulevard's emotional message becomes strongest. A person can be your reason to believe in tomorrow, but they cannot live tomorrow for you. A person can stand beside you while you confront your demons, but they cannot fight those demons on your behalf. A person can make you feel less alone, but they cannot become your entire identity. Hasley and Luke have to discover these truths through experience. That makes their relationship simultaneously beautiful and painful. They are drawn together because they recognize something broken in each other, but that same brokenness creates the conditions for conflict. Their love is therefore not presented as a simple solution. It is a test. It asks whether they can remain individuals while being emotionally connected. It asks whether they can support each other without becoming dependent on each other for survival. It asks whether understanding can coexist with boundaries. It asks whether love can remain meaningful even when it cannot produce the perfect ending. These questions give Boulevard its strongest dramatic foundation. As a movie, it will probably work best for viewers who enjoy emotionally intense young adult romances and stories built around damaged characters, complicated relationships and bittersweet themes. Viewers looking for a highly realistic or radically original drama may find some of the familiar conventions limiting, while viewers already connected to the Wattpad novel may find the adaptation more emotionally rewarding. Either way, the film's central relationship gives it a clear identity. Eve Ryan's Hasley and Mikel Niso's Luke carry the emotional weight of the story, while the supporting cast creates the environment that continually tests their relationship. Sonia Mendes's direction keeps the focus on character emotion, while Javier Ruscas's screenplay translates the source material into a feature film structure. The technical team, including cinematographer Lucia C. Pan, editor Roddy McDonald and composer Beatriz Lopez Nogales, helps construct the atmosphere necessary for the romance to function. The final judgment on Boulevard should therefore recognize both sides of the film. It is not a revolutionary reinvention of the young adult romance genre, and some of its dramatic choices belong to a familiar tradition of Wattpad-inspired romantic storytelling. Yet beneath those familiar elements is a genuine attempt to explore loneliness, trauma, addiction, emotional dependence and the complicated difference between loving someone and saving them. The film's emotional power comes from the fact that Hasley and Luke do not meet when their lives are already perfect, they meet when both are vulnerable. Their connection gives them a temporary sense of belonging, and that is what makes the romance feel important. But the movie also understands that a relationship cannot remain a private escape forever. Eventually, the characters must return to their real lives, confront their histories and decide what they are willing to change. That is why the Boulevard itself becomes such a useful metaphor for the entire film. It is a place of movement, but also a place where people can pause. It can represent freedom, intimacy and escape, but it cannot become a permanent home. Hasley and Luke may find comfort there, but their problems follow them. Their past follows them. Their choices follow them. And ultimately, the emotional meaning of their relationship depends not on whether love makes everything perfect, but on what they learn about themselves because they loved each other. Boulevard is therefore best understood as a story about emotional refuge. Hasley and Luke find in each other the feeling that someone finally understands them. That feeling is powerful enough to change them, but it is not powerful enough to erase everything that came before. The film's greatest idea is that love can be a beginning rather than a cure. It can give someone the courage to look at their life differently, but the difficult work of changing that life still belongs to the individual. This makes the movie more emotionally complex than its basic premise suggests. Beneath the romance is a story about two people standing at the edge of adulthood, trying to decide whether they will remain trapped by the identities that other people have given them or whether they will take responsibility for creating something different. Hasley's move to a new city begins the process. Meeting Luke accelerates it. Their relationship becomes the emotional center of that transformation. But the journey is not simply about whether they stay together. It is about whether they become stronger, more self-aware and more honest because of what they experience. That is ultimately what gives Boulevard its value as a romantic drama. It may use familiar ingredients, but the emotional questions it raises are universal. What does it mean to love someone who is struggling? How much can one person realistically do for another? When does understanding become dependency? Can two wounded people build something healthy together? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, if love cannot save someone, can it still be worth everything it costs? Boulevard builds its entire emotional world around these questions, and that is where its strongest meaning lies. The film begins with Hasley entering a new environment and meeting a boy she has been warned to avoid, but the deeper story begins when both characters realize that the other person sees something they have been trying to hide. From that moment forward, their relationship becomes a journey through attraction, vulnerability, fear, hope and pain. It is a story in which love provides shelter but cannot permanently protect them from reality. It is a story in which damaged people can still experience something beautiful without becoming magically healed. And it is a story in which the most important destination is not necessarily the relationship itself, but the understanding that each character gains about who they are and what they need to become. Boulevard may be imperfect, conventional and emotionally heightened, but its central idea remains compelling. Sometimes two people meet not because they can save each other, but because they can show each other that there is still something worth fighting for. That distinction is the heart of the movie, and it is also the reason its romantic story can resonate with audiences who understand that real love is rarely as simple as finding the right person and living happily ever after. The emotional journey of Boulevard becomes considerably deeper when the story is examined through Hasley Weigel's perspective, because her character is not simply the romantic lead who happens to fall for Luke Howland. She is a young woman standing at a difficult point in her life, carrying personal struggles into a new environment and trying to understand what she actually wants from the future. And that makes her relationship with Luke less like a simple romantic adventure and more like a collision between two people who are both searching for a place where they can finally feel understood. Hasley's move to a new city is one of the most important structural elements of the film because it creates a sense of transition before Luke even enters her life, and that transition matters because coming-of-age stories are fundamentally about identity, change and uncertainty. Hasley is not arriving in a completely stable life and then having Luke disrupt it. She is already in the process of rebuilding herself, which means her attraction to Luke develops at a moment when she is emotionally open to something new. This is one reason the relationship becomes so intense so quickly, because Luke does not simply enter her life as another person, he becomes part of the new identity she is constructing. The danger of that situation is obvious, because when someone is still trying to figure out who they are, it can be very easy for a relationship to become part of the answer to that question. Hasley wants to know who she is, where she belongs, what her future should look like and whether she can move beyond the problems that have followed her, and Luke seems to offer a kind of emotional certainty in a life where very little feels certain. He understands parts of her that she does not easily show to other people, and that understanding makes him incredibly attractive to her. But Boulevard does not present this attraction as completely safe. The film gradually shows that being understood by another person can feel wonderful, but it can also make that person's approval or presence feel necessary. This distinction is essential because Hasley's emotional dependency on Luke is one of the elements that gives their relationship both its beauty and its danger. She does not merely want him, she begins to need the emotional world they create together, and that changes the meaning of every conflict between them. When a relationship becomes a refuge, any threat to the relationship can feel like a threat to the person's entire emotional stability. Boulevard understands this psychological mechanism and uses it to increase the tension between its leads. Hasley's connection with Luke is built around honesty, but honesty does not always produce healthy decisions. Sometimes people reveal their deepest vulnerabilities to each other and then become even more attached because they believe nobody else could understand them in the same way. This is exactly what happens between Hasley and Luke. Their shared vulnerabilities create intimacy, but that intimacy also isolates them from the outside world. The more they believe that only the other person truly understands them, the harder it becomes to imagine life without the relationship. That emotional structure gives the romance a sense of inevitability, but it also creates a question that the movie repeatedly raises. Is this love making them stronger, or is it simply making their dependence on one another stronger? The answer is complicated because the relationship does both. There are moments when Hasley clearly becomes more open, more honest and more aware of herself because of Luke. There are also moments when the intensity of the relationship causes her to ignore problems that should not be ignored. This duality is one of the strongest aspects of the story because it avoids the simplistic idea that a relationship must be either completely good or completely bad. Real relationships can contain both comfort and conflict, and Boulevard is interested in that uncomfortable middle ground. Hasley's emotional struggles also make her different from the conventional romantic heroine who enters a story with the purpose of changing the male lead. She has her own issues, and those issues mean that Luke is not simply rescuing her from boredom while she rescues him from sadness. They are both vulnerable. They are both looking for something. They are both making mistakes. This symmetry makes the romance more believable because neither character has all the answers. The film's treatment of Hasley's addiction is particularly important in this regard. Addiction is not presented as a stylish personality trait or a convenient dramatic detail. It represents a serious problem that affects her decisions and her ability to maintain control over her own life. This becomes a crucial contrast with the romantic fantasy surrounding her relationship with Luke. Love can make her feel hopeful, but it cannot automatically remove addiction. A person can be deeply loved and still struggle. A person can be surrounded by people who care about them and still make destructive choices. Boulevard's willingness to place addiction inside a romance gives the story a darker emotional foundation, because it reminds the audience that romantic happiness cannot exist separately from personal responsibility. Hasley's journey therefore has to involve more than finding someone who loves her. She has to find a way to understand herself and confront the things that are hurting her. Luke can support that journey, but he cannot complete it for her. This becomes one of the most important distinctions between romantic fantasy and emotional reality in the film. In a fantasy, the perfect relationship solves the protagonist's problems. In reality, the right relationship can sometimes make someone want to solve their problems, but the work still has to be done by the individual. Boulevard is most effective when it recognizes this difference. Luke's character provides a parallel example. He is emotionally damaged, and his behavior is shaped by his past, but Hasley's love does not magically transform him into a completely different person. The film allows him to remain complicated, and this is important because a romantic drama becomes much less convincing when a troubled character changes instantly simply because he has met the right girl. Luke's development is more difficult. His relationship with Hasley forces him to confront parts of himself that he has tried to hide, but confronting those parts is painful. The film therefore uses romance as a catalyst rather than a cure. Hasley gives Luke a reason to imagine a different future, but she cannot erase the events that made him who he is. This distinction becomes increasingly important as the story develops because the audience begins to understand that Luke's reputation is not simply a misunderstanding. There are real reasons people are wary of him. His behavior can be unpredictable, and his emotional instability can affect the people around him. The fact that Hasley sees his vulnerable side does not mean that everyone else's concerns are automatically wrong. This is one of the most mature ways to interpret the character. Luke deserves to be understood, but he also needs to take responsibility for his actions. Hasley's role is not to excuse him. Her role is to understand him while deciding what she can and cannot accept. That is a much harder emotional task than simply falling in love. The film's romantic conflict therefore becomes a question of boundaries. How far should Hasley go to support Luke? At what point does support become self-destruction? Can she love him without becoming responsible for his emotional survival? Can Luke accept love without using Hasley as an emotional lifeline? These questions are not always answered with perfect subtlety, but they are embedded deeply enough in the story to make the relationship worth examining. Boulevard also uses the contrast between public reputation and private reality to explore how young people are often judged. Luke has an identity in the eyes of his classmates and community, and that identity affects how people interact with him. Hasley initially encounters him through those judgments, but her personal experience challenges them. This is a familiar narrative device, yet it works because reputation is an important part of adolescence. Young people often become trapped inside identities created by rumors, mistakes or past behavior. Once a reputation develops, it can be difficult to escape. Luke's struggle is therefore not only internal. It is social. He has to decide whether he accepts the identity other people have assigned to him or whether he can create a different version of himself. Hasley becomes important because she refuses to see him only through the reputation, but that also places emotional pressure on her because she begins to believe that she knows the real Luke better than everyone else. That belief can become dangerous if it makes her dismiss legitimate concerns. The film's emotional complexity comes from the fact that both perspectives can contain truth. Luke is more vulnerable than people think, but he is also more troubled than Hasley initially wants to admit. Hasley is right to look beyond his reputation, but she cannot allow that compassion to blind her to his behavior. This tension gives the romance more substance than a standard bad boy narrative. It also connects to the film's broader theme of perception. People rarely see the whole person. They see fragments. Friends see one version. Family members see another. Romantic partners see another. Sometimes the person we love most is the person who sees the parts of us that nobody else sees. But even that perspective is incomplete. Hasley can understand Luke better than some people, but she cannot know everything inside him. Luke can understand Hasley's pain, but he cannot fully experience it for her. This is an important psychological reality, and Boulevard repeatedly circles around it. Love can create extraordinary intimacy, but no person can completely enter another person's mind. That means every relationship contains an element of mystery. The person beside you can be deeply familiar and still remain partly unknown. The film uses that mystery to sustain the emotional tension between Hasley and Luke. They are constantly learning new things about each other, and each discovery changes the way they understand the relationship. Their romance therefore evolves through revelation. At first, they are attracted to each other's surface qualities. Then they begin to discover vulnerabilities. Then they discover problems. Then they discover that the problems cannot simply be ignored. This progression is important because it transforms the romance from attraction into responsibility. Falling in love is easy compared with deciding what to do after you discover the difficult truth about the person you love. Boulevard is ultimately more interested in that second stage. It wants to explore what happens after the idealized version of a person begins to disappear. This is where the film's emotional realism becomes strongest. Every new relationship begins with projection. People imagine who the other person is. They notice attractive qualities and often ignore warning signs. Over time, reality replaces projection. The question becomes whether love survives that transition. Hasley initially sees Luke as mysterious and intriguing, but eventually she has to see him as a complete human being with weaknesses, trauma and responsibility. Luke does the same with Hasley. He cannot simply see her as the girl who understands him. He has to see her as an individual with her own problems and needs. Their relationship becomes stronger when they recognize each other as complete people rather than emotional solutions. This is the difference between idealization and intimacy. Idealization says, You are exactly what I need. Intimacy says, I see who you really are, and I still choose to understand you while respecting myself. Boulevard does not always articulate that difference directly, but it is central to the emotional architecture of the story. The character of Matt adds another dimension to this idea because his presence forces Hasley to compare emotional intensity with stability. Matt represents a relationship that may appear simpler, while Luke represents a connection that feels more powerful and unpredictable. This contrast is common in romantic fiction, but the movie can be read as questioning the assumption that the most intense relationship is automatically the most meaningful. Intensity can come from compatibility, but it can also come from instability. Sometimes the strongest emotional highs occur because the relationship is uncertain, and that uncertainty creates anxiety that can be mistaken for passion. Boulevard's story is particularly interesting when viewed through that lens because Hasley's attraction to Luke is partly connected to the emotional unpredictability surrounding him. The relationship feels important because it never feels completely safe. Every moment of closeness carries the possibility of loss. That can make love feel more intense, but it can also make the relationship exhausting. This is another reason the film's romantic appeal is closely tied to its darker themes. The story wants the audience to understand why Hasley cannot simply walk away from Luke, but it also wants the audience to question whether staying is always the right decision. This is a difficult balance for a romantic drama because audiences often want to root for the couple. If the film makes the relationship too unhealthy, the romance becomes uncomfortable. If it makes the relationship too perfect, the serious themes lose credibility. Boulevard occupies the middle ground. Hasley and Luke genuinely care about each other, but their problems create consequences. That middle ground is where the film's emotional tension becomes strongest. The movie's treatment of family further complicates the relationship. Luke's father, played by Zahera, represents part of the history that Luke cannot escape, while Hasley's mother, played by Esther Aceba, is connected to the circumstances that bring Hasley into her new environment. Family relationships in the film are not simply background details. They help explain why the characters have developed the emotional patterns they have. People do not become emotionally complicated in isolation. Their childhood experiences, family dynamics, losses and social environments all contribute to who they become. Boulevard understands this and uses family history to give the central romance greater emotional weight. Luke's pain is not created by Hasley, and Hasley's addiction is not created by Luke. These problems existed before they met. That fact is crucial because it prevents the relationship from being treated as the cause of every problem. Instead, the relationship becomes the place where those problems become visible. This is one of the most effective ways to interpret their romance. Hasley and Luke do not create each other's wounds, they expose them. When someone becomes emotionally close to us, hidden weaknesses become harder to conceal. A casual acquaintance can remain unaware of our problems, but a romantic partner eventually sees them. That is why intimacy can be frightening. It removes the protection of distance. Boulevard uses that vulnerability to create emotional stakes. The more Hasley and Luke care about each other, the more they have to risk by being honest. They cannot maintain the image they showed each other at the beginning. Eventually, the real person has to appear. This process is especially important for Luke because his identity is built around emotional defense. He has learned to protect himself through distance, attitude and unpredictability. Hasley disrupts that defense. She refuses to accept the surface version of him, and that forces him into a position he is not comfortable with. Being understood can be frightening when a person has spent years trying not to be understood. Luke's relationship with Hasley therefore contains both comfort and fear. He wants her close because she makes him feel seen, but he may also fear what she will see if she gets too close. This contradiction makes his behavior unpredictable and gives the romance psychological tension. Hasley experiences a similar contradiction. She wants Luke to understand her, but being completely understood also means revealing the parts of herself she would rather hide. The film's most powerful romantic moments therefore emerge from mutual vulnerability. The attraction becomes meaningful when both characters stop performing and allow themselves to be honest. These scenes are important because they show that the relationship is not based only on physical attraction. The characters become emotionally intimate. They tell each other things they cannot easily tell other people. They share dreams and fears. They create memories. Those moments give the relationship a sense of authenticity even when the surrounding plot becomes melodramatic. The film's title gains additional meaning through these intimate moments. The Boulevard becomes the place where the characters can step outside the identities imposed on them. Luke does not have to be the troubled boy. Hasley does not have to be the girl struggling with her problems. They can simply be two people together. But the fact that this freedom exists only inside their private space makes it fragile. Eventually, the outside world will demand that they return to their identities and responsibilities. This tension between escape and reality is one of the movie's defining characteristics. Boulevard can therefore be understood as a story about the limits of romantic escapism. Romance can make the world feel different, but it cannot make the world disappear. Hasley and Luke can create a private universe, but they still have to live in the real one. That is why the film's later conflicts carry emotional significance even if some of the plot developments are familiar to the genre. The audience understands that the relationship is being tested not simply by another person or a misunderstanding, but by the unresolved issues that existed before the romance began. This is a more meaningful source of conflict because it cannot be defeated by a single dramatic conversation. Personal problems require time. Trauma does not disappear after one emotional confession. Addiction does not disappear after one promise. Family damage does not disappear because someone falls in love. Boulevard's willingness to keep these problems present gives the story a darker and more realistic foundation. At the same time, the film remains a romantic drama, so it continues to emphasize emotional connection, chemistry and the possibility of hope. That balance is difficult, and the movie does not always achieve it perfectly. There are moments when the emotional storytelling can feel overly direct, and some scenes may feel designed primarily to satisfy the expectations of fans of the source material. But the emotional sincerity of the central relationship remains the film's strongest asset. Hasley and Luke feel important to each other, and that matters more than whether every plot development is completely original. In romantic storytelling, emotional credibility can sometimes compensate for narrative familiarity. If the audience believes in the relationship, they will care about what happens to the characters even when they can predict some of the events. Boulevard's ability to create that investment depends heavily on the performances. Eve Ryan has to portray Hasley as someone who is simultaneously vulnerable and capable of making her own choices. The character cannot become completely dependent on Luke without losing her identity, and Ryan's performance gives Hasley an emotional presence beyond the romance. Mikel Niso similarly has to balance Luke's difficult exterior with the vulnerability underneath. If Luke were played only as a dangerous romantic figure, the character would become a cliché. His performance needs to make the audience believe that there is a wounded person underneath the behavior. When the balance works, Luke becomes sympathetic without becoming idealized. That is an important distinction. The audience can care about him while still recognizing that he has problems that need to be confronted. The supporting performances help create the world around them, particularly because the movie depends on the contrast between the private romance and the public environment. Friends and family members provide different perspectives on the relationship, and these perspectives remind the audience that Hasley and Luke do not exist inside their own emotional bubble. Their decisions have consequences for other people. This is important because one of the dangers of intense young adult romance is that the couple can begin to behave as if nobody else matters. Boulevard uses its supporting characters to challenge that isolation. Friends can question decisions. Family can create pressure. Other relationships can expose weaknesses that the central couple refuses to acknowledge. This broader social context prevents the romance from becoming completely detached from reality. Another important element is the film's approach to youth. Boulevard is fundamentally interested in characters who are still becoming adults. They are old enough to experience complex emotions but young enough to lack the experience needed to understand those emotions fully. That creates a believable contradiction. They may know exactly how strongly they feel, but they may not know what to do with those feelings. This is why their choices can seem extreme. The film is not necessarily saying that every young person behaves this way. It is presenting a heightened version of youthful emotional experience. First love can feel permanent because there is not enough distance to see it as one experience among many. A breakup can feel like the end of the world because the person has not yet experienced enough life to know that pain changes. A new relationship can feel like salvation because the person has not yet learned that emotional stability must come from within as well as from other people. Boulevard captures this emotional intensity effectively when it focuses on the characters rather than the plot. The story becomes less about what happens and more about how the characters experience what happens. This is the heart of the film's coming-of-age identity. Hasley's journey is ultimately about learning to separate love from identity. Luke's journey is about learning to separate pain from identity. Both characters have been defined by things they did not choose. Hasley is struggling with problems that make her feel trapped, while Luke is trapped by a past and reputation that have become part of how others see him. Their relationship gives them a chance to imagine different versions of themselves. But imagination is not enough. To become those new versions, they have to make difficult choices. This is where Boulevard becomes more than a love story. It becomes a story about self-definition. Who are you when nobody is watching? Who are you when the person you love is disappointed in you? Who are you when the relationship that gave you hope begins to hurt you? Who are you when you have to choose between protecting another person and protecting yourself? These are questions that the movie raises through its central relationship. They are not easy questions, and the film's emotional impact comes from refusing to make the answers simple. Love is not portrayed as purely good or purely destructive. It is powerful. That power can be used to build or destroy depending on how the people involved handle it. Hasley and Luke are learning this in real time. Their relationship becomes a laboratory for emotional maturity. Every decision teaches them something, but some lessons come through pain. That is why the film can feel bittersweet even during its romantic moments. The audience knows that the very qualities making the relationship beautiful can also make it fragile. Their ability to understand each other creates intimacy, but their shared vulnerabilities create instability. Their desire to protect each other creates loyalty, but it can also create dependency. Their willingness to stay together creates hope, but it can also make them ignore problems. This contradiction is the emotional engine of Boulevard. The movie is therefore strongest when it avoids asking whether Hasley and Luke are meant to be, and instead asks whether they are capable of being healthy together. Destiny is easy to romanticize. Compatibility is harder. Two people can feel an extraordinary connection and still be wrong for each other at a particular moment in their lives. Sometimes people meet too early. Sometimes they love each other but lack the emotional maturity needed to sustain the relationship. Sometimes the relationship becomes a necessary chapter in their growth even if it cannot become their entire future. Boulevard's story can be interpreted through this lens, and doing so makes the romance more emotionally sophisticated. The film's title becomes almost ironic in this interpretation. A boulevard suggests movement, but Hasley and Luke often want to stop time. They want to preserve the feeling of being together before reality changes it. They want the private world they have created to remain untouched. But life does not stop. People change. Circumstances change. The emotional refuge eventually has to confront the outside world. This is the central tension of the movie. It is not whether the characters can create a beautiful relationship. They can. The question is whether that relationship can survive the realities they carry with them. That question gives the film its dramatic momentum. As the story progresses, the audience is increasingly encouraged to understand that the romance is not an escape from the characters' problems but a place where those problems become impossible to ignore. Luke's pain becomes visible. Hasley's addiction becomes more significant. Family histories become relevant. Friendships become strained. The consequences of decisions become unavoidable. The boulevard is no longer simply a place of freedom. It becomes a place where the characters have to confront what their relationship really means. This is the point where the movie's emotional stakes become strongest. The romance is no longer just about attraction. It becomes about responsibility. It becomes about whether love can coexist with boundaries, whether compassion can coexist with self-respect, and whether two people can support each other without losing themselves. Those questions are universal, which is why the movie can appeal beyond its Wattpad origins. Even viewers who do not connect with every stylistic choice can recognize the emotional experience of loving someone while realizing that love alone cannot solve everything. Boulevard's most important lesson is therefore not that love saves people. It is that love can reveal what needs to be saved. Hasley's relationship with Luke exposes parts of herself she has been avoiding. Luke's relationship with Hasley exposes vulnerabilities he has spent years hiding. Their romance becomes a mirror, and mirrors can be both beautiful and painful because they show the truth. The characters cannot remain forever inside the idealized version of themselves that existed when they first met. They have to confront who they really are. That is the deeper meaning of their relationship. They are not simply falling in love with each other. They are falling into a situation where they can no longer hide from themselves. This is why the film's emotional conclusion cannot be understood simply through the question of whether the romance succeeds or fails. The more important measure is what Hasley and Luke become because of the relationship. If they learn that they are capable of being honest, if they learn that their problems deserve to be confronted, if they learn that loving someone does not require abandoning themselves, then the relationship has meaning regardless of its ultimate outcome. Boulevard's emotional value lies in that possibility. The film may be marketed as a romance, but its deepest subject is emotional growth. Hasley begins the story looking for a new beginning. Luke begins it carrying a past he cannot easily escape. Their meeting gives them both the possibility of change. But the movie gradually makes clear that change cannot be handed from one person to another. Hasley has to change herself. Luke has to change himself. They can inspire each other, but they cannot do the work for each other. That is the line between love and rescue, and Boulevard repeatedly approaches it. The story becomes most powerful when it respects that line. It becomes weaker when it allows romantic fantasy to blur it. Overall, the second major layer of Boulevard is therefore the psychological development of its two leads. Hasley is learning that being loved does not mean being fixed, and Luke is learning that being understood does not mean being excused. Their relationship gives them a place to confront these truths, even when those truths hurt. The movie's romantic appeal comes from the tenderness between them, while its dramatic weight comes from the problems that tenderness cannot solve. This combination gives Boulevard a bittersweet quality that goes beyond a simple love story. It is a story about two people trying to build a private world while carrying the entire weight of their real lives with them. The Boulevard gives them somewhere to. The emotional world of Boulevard becomes even more complicated when the relationship between Hasley Weigel and Luke Howland is examined through the idea of first love, because the film is not simply interested in showing two young people becoming attracted to each other. It is interested in showing how first love can completely change the way a person sees themselves, their future, their fears, and even their understanding of happiness. And this is where Boulevard finds one of its most recognizable but also most emotionally effective themes. Hasley enters Luke's life during a period when she is already searching for something different, and Luke enters Hasley's life carrying a past that has made him suspicious of emotional closeness, so their meeting creates a strange balance between hope and danger. Hasley sees possibility in Luke, while Luke sees acceptance in Hasley. And because both characters are emotionally vulnerable, their attraction develops into something much stronger than either of them initially expects. The film's depiction of first love is intentionally intense because first love often feels larger than ordinary experience. When people are young and experiencing certain emotions for the first time, they do not yet have enough distance to understand how those feelings will change over time. Happiness can feel permanent, sadness can feel endless, and the person who makes you feel understood can seem like the only person who ever will. Boulevard builds its central romance around that emotional intensity, and the result is a relationship that feels powerful precisely because the characters do not know how to separate love from the rest of their identities. Hasley does not simply like Luke. She begins to see him as part of the future she is imagining for herself. Luke does not simply care about Hasley, he begins to experience her as one of the few people who can reach the part of him that he normally keeps hidden. This creates genuine tenderness, but it also creates a dangerous emotional dependence. The film's strongest dramatic question is therefore not whether the two characters love each other, because they clearly do, but whether they understand what that love requires. Love requires honesty, but honesty can be frightening. Love requires trust, but trust can be difficult when someone has already experienced emotional pain. Love requires boundaries, but boundaries can feel like rejection to someone who is afraid of being abandoned. Love requires two people to remain individuals, but intense first love can make two people want to become one emotional unit. Boulevard explores these contradictions through Hasley and Luke without turning their relationship into a simple lesson. The film wants the audience to feel the beauty of their connection while also recognizing the problems underneath it. This is especially important because Luke's troubled personality initially creates the impression that Hasley is entering a dangerous relationship. Yet the movie complicates that impression by showing that Luke is not simply cruel or reckless. His difficult behavior is connected to trauma and emotional damage, and Hasley recognizes that damage in a way that other people do not. She sees the boy behind the reputation. This is the emotional reason she continues to be drawn toward him. But the film also needs to establish that understanding someone does not mean becoming responsible for them. That distinction becomes increasingly important as the relationship develops. Hasley wants to help Luke because she cares about him, but she cannot remove the experiences that shaped him. She can listen, support him and provide emotional comfort, but she cannot become the solution to every problem in his life. Luke must ultimately confront his own past. The same is true for Hasley. Luke can love her, but he cannot eliminate her addiction or make every difficult decision for her. He can encourage her, but she has to choose what happens next. This mutual limitation gives the romance its emotional realism. Neither character has the power to save the other completely, and that is exactly why their relationship feels vulnerable. In a conventional romantic fantasy, the arrival of the right person solves the protagonist's problems. Boulevard is more interesting because the arrival of the right person actually exposes the problems more clearly. Hasley's feelings for Luke make her more emotionally open, but that openness also means she has more to lose. Luke's feelings for Hasley give him hope, but hope also makes him vulnerable to disappointment. The stronger their connection becomes, the more frightening the possibility of losing it becomes. This is the psychology of emotional dependency, and it is one of the most important themes running beneath the romance. When someone has spent a long time feeling alone, finally finding one person who seems to understand everything can create an enormous emotional attachment. That attachment can feel like safety, but it can also become fear. If the relationship ends, the person may feel as though they are losing not only a partner but the only place where they felt truly understood. Boulevard uses this emotional logic to make the relationship feel intense without requiring the characters to constantly explain why they cannot let go of each other. Their attachment is rooted in vulnerability. They have shown each other parts of themselves that are difficult to show anyone else, and that creates a bond that is difficult to break. This is also why the film's quieter moments are often more important than its larger dramatic scenes. When Hasley and Luke are simply talking, sharing a private joke, walking together or revealing something personal, the audience sees the foundation of the relationship. The dramatic conflicts matter because they threaten that foundation. Without those quieter moments, the later problems would have less emotional weight. The film therefore depends on the audience believing that the relationship contains genuine tenderness. Eve Ryan and Mikel Niso have to communicate that tenderness through small gestures and changes in expression as much as through dialogue. The emotional chemistry between them becomes the center of the film because the entire story depends on the audience caring about what happens when their private world begins to collapse under external pressure. Hasley's character also becomes more interesting when the film is viewed through the idea of self-discovery. Her move to a new city represents a chance to become someone different, but she quickly discovers that changing locations does not automatically erase internal problems. This is a familiar coming-of-age theme, but Boulevard connects it directly to romance. Hasley begins to associate Luke with the new version of herself she wants to become. That makes the relationship exciting, but it also creates the possibility that she will confuse personal transformation with romantic transformation. She may feel that because she is in love, she is becoming a better version of herself, when in reality she still has to confront the problems that existed before Luke arrived. The film's more mature interpretation is that a relationship can be a catalyst for change without being the change itself. Luke can inspire Hasley, but Hasley still has to make her own choices. This distinction is especially important when addiction becomes part of the emotional conflict. Addiction is one of the elements that makes Hasley's story darker because it shows that emotional problems cannot simply be solved through affection. Love may provide motivation, but recovery and responsibility require action. Boulevard therefore avoids one of the most dangerous romantic drama clichés, the idea that a troubled person becomes healthy simply because they find someone who loves them enough. Instead, the movie presents love as a source of hope while leaving the responsibility for change with the individual. This is also true for Luke's trauma. His past explains his behavior, but it does not give him permission to remain trapped in it forever. The character's journey involves recognizing that his identity cannot be reduced to what happened to him. This is difficult because trauma often changes the way people understand themselves. If someone has experienced enough pain, they may begin to believe that pain is all they are capable of knowing. Luke's relationship with Hasley challenges that belief. She sees a future in him that he cannot easily see in himself. That is powerful, but it also places emotional pressure on both of them. Luke may begin to feel that he must become the person Hasley believes he can be, while Hasley may begin to feel responsible for ensuring that he does. This is where love can become complicated by expectation. If Luke fails to change, Hasley may feel disappointed or guilty. If Hasley struggles, Luke may feel powerless. Both characters can begin to believe that their relationship has to succeed because so much emotional meaning has been attached to it. That makes every conflict larger than it would be in a normal relationship. A disagreement is no longer simply a disagreement. It becomes evidence that the relationship may be failing. A secret is no longer simply a secret. It becomes a threat to the emotional world they have created. A moment of distance can feel like abandonment. Boulevard understands this emotional amplification and uses it to create the heightened tone associated with first love. The film's title continues to function as a metaphor for this private emotional world. The Boulevard is where Hasley and Luke can imagine a future that feels separate from the problems surrounding them. It is a place of movement and possibility, but it also represents a temporary escape. The characters want to believe that if they stay together, they can remain inside that emotional space forever. But the film's deeper message is that nobody can remain in a fantasy indefinitely. Reality always returns. Family problems return. Personal habits return. Addiction returns. Trauma returns. Social consequences return. Eventually, the characters have to confront the fact that love exists inside a larger world. This is where the movie moves beyond the simple question of romance and becomes a story about responsibility. It asks whether Hasley and Luke can love each other while still accepting responsibility for themselves. That question is especially important for Luke because his difficult past can make it tempting for both the audience and Hasley to excuse his behavior. But a sympathetic character is not automatically a morally perfect character. The movie becomes stronger when it allows Luke to be both wounded and responsible. He can deserve compassion while still needing to change. Hasley can understand his pain while still having boundaries. This is the kind of emotional complexity that prevents the story from becoming purely idealized. It also makes Hasley's choices more meaningful. If she simply stayed with Luke because he was misunderstood, her character would become passive. If she stayed because she believed she could save him, the relationship would become unhealthy. But if she stays while recognizing both his strengths and his limitations, then her decision becomes more mature. Boulevard's emotional tension therefore depends on Hasley learning the difference between loving Luke and managing Luke. Those are not the same thing. A partner can be supportive without becoming a caretaker. A person can listen without taking responsibility for another person's emotional survival. This is one of the most important lessons contained within the film. The same principle applies in the opposite direction. Luke cannot make Hasley healthy simply by loving her. He can encourage her, but he cannot control her choices. This mutual limitation is what makes the romance meaningful. Neither character can be the other's cure. They can only be part of each other's journey. The film's supporting characters become important because they provide perspectives that challenge the central couple's tendency to see their relationship as the center of everything. Friends and family members can notice things that Hasley and Luke cannot see because they are emotionally involved. This is a realistic aspect of relationships. People inside a relationship often interpret events through emotion, while outsiders can sometimes recognize patterns more clearly. Boulevard uses its supporting cast to create this wider perspective, even though the central story remains focused on Hasley and Luke. Matt, in particular, creates a contrast that forces Hasley to think about what she actually wants. His presence represents a different kind of romantic possibility, one that is less defined by danger and emotional volatility. The contrast is not simply about choosing between two boys. It is about choosing between two models of love. One is intense and unpredictable. The other appears more stable. The movie does not reduce the choice to a simple good versus bad decision because relationships cannot be evaluated purely by surface qualities. A stable relationship can still be emotionally empty, while an intense relationship can be deeply meaningful but unhealthy. The challenge is determining what actually allows two people to grow. This is where Boulevard becomes a coming-of-age story. Hasley has to learn that she cannot make her decision based only on how strongly she feels. She has to consider what the relationship does to her as a person. Does it help her become more honest? Does it encourage her to confront her problems? Does it allow her to pursue her dreams? Does it give her space to remain herself? These questions matter more than the simple question of whether Luke loves her. The film's strongest emotional scenes are therefore the ones in which love and identity intersect. Hasley's dreams are important because they represent a life outside the relationship. If she abandons those dreams completely, the romance becomes a form of self-erasure. Luke also needs a future that exists beyond Hasley. If his entire reason for living becomes one person, then the relationship becomes unstable because it places an impossible burden on both partners. Boulevard's deeper message is that healthy love should expand a person's world rather than shrink it. This is particularly important for young audiences because first love can easily become all-consuming. The movie does not have to reject that intensity, instead, it can show why intensity needs balance. Hasley and Luke are allowed to feel deeply, but they also have to learn that feeling deeply does not remove the need for self-respect. That is where the film's themes of maturity become strongest. The transition from adolescence to adulthood is partly the process of learning that emotions and actions are connected but not identical. You can feel anger without acting cruelly. You can feel jealousy without controlling another person. You can feel fear without allowing fear to determine every decision. You can love someone without sacrificing yourself completely. Boulevard's characters are still learning these lessons, which explains why their relationship is so emotionally unpredictable. They are not finished adults. They are becoming adults. Their mistakes are therefore part of the story's meaning. The movie does not require them to know everything from the beginning. It requires them to learn. This makes their relationship more sympathetic because the audience can understand why they make choices that may seem irrational from a distance. Youth does not mean a lack of intelligence, it means a lack of experience. Hasley and Luke can be intelligent and still make emotionally driven decisions because they are experiencing certain situations for the first time. Boulevard uses that emotional inexperience to create both romance and conflict. The film's tone also reflects this. It is not a restrained relationship drama in which every emotion is expressed quietly. It is heightened, romantic and sometimes melodramatic. This stylistic choice is closely connected to the source material's wrkpaid origins, where emotional immediacy is part of the appeal. The adaptation therefore has to preserve a certain level of intensity to remain recognizable to its existing audience. Critics who prefer subtle realism may find this style excessive, while fans of the original novel may see that intensity as one of the film's defining strengths. The important thing is that the movie remains emotionally consistent with the world it is trying to create. The performances help ground the heightened material. When Eve Ryan allows Hasley's vulnerability to appear without turning every moment into a dramatic declaration, the character becomes more believable. When Mikel allows Luke's pain to appear beneath his defensive behavior, the character becomes more than a stereotype. Their chemistry becomes particularly important because romantic storytelling can collapse if the central pair does not feel emotionally connected. The audience has to believe that Hasley and Luke would choose each other despite the problems surrounding them. The film's success therefore depends on the chemistry more than on plot twists. If the chemistry works, the story's familiar elements become emotionally effective. If it does not, the same elements can feel predictable. This is why the performances deserve attention even when evaluating the screenplay's weaknesses. The movie's technical filmmaking also contributes to the emotional atmosphere. Cinematography, editing, production design, costumes and music work together to create a world that feels young, romantic and emotionally charged. The visual design does not need to compete with the characters. It exists to frame them. In a story like Boulevard, the most important visual element is often the distance between two people. When Hasley and Luke are physically close, the frame can emphasize intimacy. When they are separated, the same space can emphasize loneliness. This kind of visual storytelling can communicate emotional information without requiring dialogue. The film's locations also help distinguish private and public life. Public spaces are associated with reputation and expectations, while private spaces allow vulnerability. The contrast mirrors the characters' internal lives. Luke's public identity is difficult and guarded, while his private identity is more fragile. Hasley's public life is influenced by her circumstances, while her private moments reveal the struggles she does not easily share. Their relationship becomes the place where these public and private selves meet. That meeting creates intimacy, but it also creates the risk that the private self becomes completely dependent on one person for validation. This is why the film's romance is simultaneously comforting and dangerous. The more Hasley and Luke rely on each other, the more they risk losing the ability to stand independently. Boulevard does not present independence and love as opposites, but it shows how easily they can become confused. A person can love someone deeply and still need a life outside the relationship. A person can be emotionally available without becoming emotionally dependent. A person can ask for help without giving up responsibility for themselves. These are mature relationship concepts, and the movie places them inside an emotionally heightened young adult story. That combination is one of the reasons Boulevard is worth analyzing beyond its surface-level romance. It is not simply asking the audience to root for a couple. It is asking the audience to think about what makes a relationship meaningful. Is it the intensity of the emotions? Is it the number of sacrifices? Is it how much pain the characters are willing to endure? Or is it whether the relationship allows both people to become more complete versions of themselves? The movie leans toward the final idea, even when its melodramatic elements sometimes suggest otherwise. The story's emotional tragedy comes from the possibility that two people can love each other sincerely and still be unable to solve the problems that stand between them. This is an important distinction because popular romance often treats separation as proof that love was not strong enough. Boulevard can be interpreted differently. Sometimes love is strong, but circumstances, trauma, addiction, personal responsibility and emotional maturity are stronger forces. A relationship can be meaningful without being able to overcome everything. That idea makes the story more bittersweet and more realistic. It also gives the characters a sense of dignity because they are not reduced to whether they remain together. Their growth matters independently of their romantic outcome. Hasley's journey is about becoming someone who can understand her own needs. Luke's journey is about becoming someone who can confront his own pain. Their relationship accelerates those journeys, but it does not own them. That is the real significance of first love in Boulevard. First love can be unforgettable without being permanent. It can change your understanding of yourself even if the relationship eventually changes. It can teach you what you want, what you fear, what you need and what you cannot accept. In that sense, the Boulevard is not simply the destination of the story. It is part of the journey. Hasley and Luke meet there emotionally, but they cannot stay there forever. They have to continue moving. The road ahead is uncertain, but uncertainty is part of growing up. The movie's emotional power comes from this tension between wanting to preserve a perfect moment and knowing that life cannot remain still. Every relationship changes over time. People change. Circumstances change. Priorities change. The version of Hasley who first meets Luke is not necessarily the version who will exist later. The same is true for Luke. Their love is therefore connected to change from the beginning. The tragedy is that change can bring people closer or push them apart. Boulevard uses that uncertainty to keep the relationship emotionally alive. The audience knows that the characters cannot simply return to the beginning. Once they learn more about each other, the relationship becomes different. Once secrets are revealed, innocence changes. Once problems become visible, the fantasy becomes harder to maintain. This is the natural progression of intimacy. At first, people fall in love with what they think they know. Then they discover what they did not know. The relationship either becomes deeper through acceptance or weaker through disillusionment. Boulevard places Hasley and Luke directly inside this process. Their relationship is therefore not static. It evolves as their understanding evolves. This is also why the film's emotional conflicts are more significant than simple misunderstandings. The central problems are rooted in who the characters are, not just in what information they lack. A misunderstanding can be solved by explaining the truth. Trauma cannot be solved that way. Addiction cannot be solved that way. Family damage cannot be solved that way. Emotional dependency cannot be solved by one conversation. The film's deeper conflicts therefore have more weight because they require personal change rather than simple plot resolution. That is where Boulevard's drama becomes more mature. The movie may still use the familiar language of young adult romance, but its central problems are not superficial. They are connected to identity, mental and emotional health, family and responsibility. The film's ability to balance those serious themes with its romantic tone is imperfect, but the ambition is clear. It wants to tell a story that is emotionally appealing while also reminding the audience that love has consequences. The relationship between Hasley and Luke is not dangerous because they love each other. It becomes dangerous when love starts replacing responsibility. That distinction is central. Love should not require someone to abandon their dreams, ignore their problems or accept behavior that harms them. The strongest interpretation of Boulevard therefore treats the romance as a catalyst for self-discovery rather than as a final answer. Hasley needs to discover who she is beyond Luke. Luke needs to discover who he is beyond his trauma and reputation. Their relationship can help them reach those discoveries, but it cannot make the discoveries for them. This is ultimately what makes their romance emotionally meaningful. They do not meet because they are perfect for each other. They meet because they are capable of seeing something in each other that other people have missed. Sometimes that is enough to change a life. Sometimes it is not enough to create a permanent relationship. The film leaves room for that ambiguity, and that ambiguity is more interesting than a simple message that love conquers all. Boulevard's emotional world is built around the idea that people can become temporary homes for each other. A person can enter your life and give you a place to breathe when everything else feels overwhelming. That does not mean they can become your entire home forever. Hasley and Luke's Boulevard is therefore both beautiful and fragile. It is beautiful because they create it together. It is fragile because it depends on two people who are still learning how to stand on their own. The emotional meaning of the story lies in that fragility. Their love matters because it is real, not because it is perfect. Their mistakes matter because they are learning. Their pain matters because it reveals what they need to confront. Their dreams matter because they remind us that neither character should disappear inside the relationship. As the story moves forward, The central challenge becomes whether Hasley and Luke can transform their intense connection into something that does not destroy their individual identities. That is the question that gives the romance its lasting dramatic power. Boulevard is therefore not simply a movie about two people falling in love. It is a movie about what happens when two vulnerable people fall in love before they have completely figured themselves out. The result is beautiful, complicated, unstable and deeply emotional. The film's familiar romantic conventions may limit its originality, but the psychological questions underneath those conventions give the story substance. Hasley and Luke are not simply trying to find happiness. They are trying to discover whether happiness can exist alongside responsibility, healing and personal growth. Their relationship becomes a test of whether love can be both emotionally intense and emotionally healthy. That is a much more difficult challenge than simply making two characters fall in love, and it is what keeps Boulevard from being only a conventional romance. The movie's most important idea remains clear. Love can open a door, but the person still has to walk through it. Hasley can encourage Luke to believe in a different future, but Luke has to choose it. Luke can make Hasley feel understood, but Hasley has to confront her own struggles. Neither can become the other's cure. They can be companions on the road, but they cannot walk the road for each other. The boulevard can give them a place to meet, but eventually they have to continue moving, and the direction they choose will determine who they become. Breathe, but eventually they have to continue down the road. That journey is where the real meaning of the movie lies, because love may be the reason they begin moving, but self-awareness is what determines where they ultimately go. Boulevard becomes increasingly compelling when its central relationship is examined through the idea of emotional responsibility, because beneath the romantic attraction between Hasley Weigel and Luke Howland lies a much more difficult question about what people owe each other when they become emotionally close, and this question gives the film a darker dimension than its young adult romance surface initially suggests. Hasley and Luke do not meet when their lives are stable and uncomplicated. They meet while both are carrying personal problems, family histories, emotional wounds and uncertainties about their futures, and that timing is crucial because it means their relationship develops inside an environment where love cannot remain separate from pain. Hasley sees something in Luke that other people fail to see, while Luke discovers that Hasley is willing to look past the reputation that has followed him, and their mutual recognition creates a powerful bond. But the same bond gradually creates a responsibility that neither character initially understands. When someone becomes the person you trust most, their emotions begin to affect your own emotional stability, and Boulevard explores how that can become both beautiful and dangerous. The film is particularly interested in the difference between caring for someone and becoming responsible for everything that happens to them. Hasley genuinely cares about Luke, and her desire to understand him comes from compassion rather than simple curiosity, but compassion becomes complicated when it turns into the belief that she must keep him safe at all times. Luke, in the same way, can care deeply about Hasley while still being unable to control the problems she faces. This is where the movie's romance begins to resemble a psychological study of dependence. The characters do not simply want to be together, they begin to feel that being together is necessary. That difference changes everything. Wanting someone is romantic. Feeling that you cannot survive without them is much more dangerous. Boulevard uses the intensity of first love to blur that boundary because Hasley and Luke are young and inexperienced enough to believe that the strength of their feelings proves the importance of their relationship. The audience can understand why they feel this way because first love often carries an almost overwhelming sense of permanence. The first person who truly understands you can seem irreplaceable, and the first relationship that makes you feel emotionally complete can seem like the only relationship that ever could. The film captures this emotional illusion while also showing its consequences. Hasley begins to see Luke as a central part of her identity, and Luke begins to experience Hasley as a source of emotional stability. The relationship therefore becomes more than romance, it becomes an emotional structure on which both characters begin to depend. This is where the title Boulevard becomes increasingly meaningful. The boulevard is a place where the characters can escape the identities and expectations surrounding them, but an escape route cannot become a permanent substitute for reality. The characters eventually have to return to their responsibilities, and when they do, the problems they tried to leave behind are still waiting for them. The metaphor works because the boulevard is simultaneously a place of freedom and a reminder of movement. Hasley and Luke want to stop time there, but life keeps moving. Their relationship cannot remain untouched by the realities of addiction, trauma, family conflict, personal responsibility and emotional growth. This is one of the most important themes of the film. Love can create a beautiful temporary world, but it cannot suspend reality. Hasley's personal struggle with addiction is especially important because it prevents the romance from becoming a simple story of emotional rescue. Her problems existed before Luke entered her life, and they remain present after the relationship begins. This means that Luke cannot be presented as the solution to her life. He can make her feel understood, but he cannot remove the underlying issue. That distinction gives Hasley more depth because it forces her to confront herself rather than simply relying on the relationship. Her journey is therefore partly about learning that she must take ownership of her own life. She can accept love without allowing love to become an excuse for avoiding difficult choices. This is one of the strongest coming-of-age elements in Boulevard. Growing up means learning that nobody else can completely fix your life, even when that person loves you deeply. Hasley may want Luke to be the person who makes everything better, but eventually she has to understand that her future depends on her own decisions. The same principle applies to Luke, whose emotional damage is connected to a painful past that has shaped his behavior. His story is not simply about finding a girl who sees the good in him. It is about confronting the fact that the good inside him does not erase the damage he has experienced or caused. Luke's character is compelling because the film does not make him completely innocent. His history explains why he behaves the way he does, but explanation and justification are different things. A person can be deeply wounded and still have responsibilities. A person can be emotionally fragile and still hurt someone else. A person can deserve understanding and still need to change. Boulevard's treatment of Luke becomes more meaningful when this distinction is kept in mind. Hasley's compassion is valuable because she refuses to reduce him to his reputation, but her compassion becomes dangerous if it turns into unconditional acceptance of everything he does. The film therefore places her in a difficult position. She has to decide whether she is loving the real Luke or the version of Luke she believes he could become. This is one of the most psychologically important questions in the entire story. When people fall in love, they often see potential as well as reality. They do not only love who someone is, they may also love who they believe that person could become. That can be hopeful, but it can also create disappointment. If the person never becomes the version you imagined, the relationship can become a struggle between reality and expectation. Hasley's relationship with Luke contains this possibility. She sees his vulnerability and believes there is a better future inside him, but Luke has to choose that future himself. Hasley cannot force him to become healthier, happier or more stable. This is where Boulevard's romantic story becomes a story about boundaries. A boundary is not the opposite of love. It can actually be an expression of self-respect. The film's most mature interpretation is that Hasley can care about Luke while still recognizing the limits of what she can do. Likewise, Luke can love Hasley without believing that her entire emotional survival depends on him. The relationship becomes healthier when both characters recognize that love should not erase individuality. But first love often makes individuality difficult because young people are still developing their identities. Hasley is still discovering her dreams and Luke is still trying to understand his own history, so their relationship becomes part of that development. This makes the romance feel emotionally authentic but also unstable. They are learning about themselves at the same time they are learning about each other. Every discovery therefore has two consequences. It changes their understanding of the partner and it changes their understanding of themselves. This is why Boulevard's relationship cannot be reduced to a simple attraction. The romance becomes a mirror. Hasley sees her own vulnerabilities reflected in Luke's pain. Luke sees his own need for acceptance reflected in Hasley's willingness to stay. Their similarities create intimacy, but similarities can also reinforce unhealthy patterns. When two people share emotional wounds, they may understand each other better, but they can also make each other's problems feel normal. The film therefore raises the possibility that emotional compatibility is not always the same thing as emotional health. Two people can understand each other perfectly and still be bad for each other at a particular moment. This is a difficult idea for romantic fiction because audiences are trained to believe that being understood is proof that two people belong together. Boulevard complicates that assumption. Being understood is important, but a healthy relationship also requires stability, honesty, accountability and the ability to grow independently. Hasley and Luke have emotional chemistry, but they have to learn whether chemistry can coexist with responsibility. The presence of Matt further strengthens this contrast. Matt offers Hasley another kind of relationship possibility, one that appears less dangerous and less emotionally volatile. His presence makes the audience consider whether Hasley is attracted to Luke because he is truly compatible with her or because the intensity of the relationship makes her feel alive. This is an important distinction. Intensity can feel like passion, but sometimes it is created by uncertainty. When someone is unpredictable, every positive moment can feel more valuable because it follows anxiety. The emotional highs become stronger because the lows exist. This can create a cycle in which instability is mistaken for romance. Boulevard does not completely reject the romantic appeal of Luke's intensity, but it also gives the audience enough information to question it. That tension makes Hasley's choices more interesting. She is not simply choosing between a good boy and a bad boy. She is choosing between different emotional experiences and different versions of herself. With Luke, she feels deeply understood, but she also enters a world of emotional uncertainty. With Matt, she encounters a different possibility, but emotional safety does not automatically mean emotional fulfillment. The movie therefore avoids a completely simple answer. It asks what kind of love allows Hasley to remain herself. This question is connected to her dreams. Her dreams represent the future she wants independently of the relationship, and the more emotionally intense her connection with Luke becomes, the more important those dreams become. If she allows the romance to replace her ambitions, she risks losing the identity she was trying to build when she arrived in the new city. This is a common danger in coming-of-age romance. The protagonist can become so focused on the relationship that personal growth stops. Boulevard is more interesting when it resists that outcome and treats love as one part of Hasley's life rather than the entirety of it. Her relationship with Luke should matter, but it should not become the only reason she has a future. The same applies to Luke. His future cannot depend entirely on Hasley. If she becomes his only source of hope, then the relationship carries a burden no relationship can realistically handle. This is why the film's themes of loneliness and emotional dependency are so important. Luke's loneliness makes Hasley incredibly important to him, but that importance can become overwhelming. Hasley's own loneliness makes Luke equally important to her. They begin to function as emotional mirrors, and that can feel beautiful because each person finally feels seen. But a mirror cannot become a foundation. A healthy identity has to exist independently. Boulevard's emotional lesson is therefore that being loved should help a person become more themselves, not less. Hasley needs to remain Hasley even while loving Luke. Luke needs to remain responsible for his own life even while loving Hasley. Their relationship becomes meaningful when it expands their identities rather than replacing them. This is also where the film's family relationships become significant. Hasley's connection with her mother represents one of the few relationships in her life that existed before Luke. Her mother is part of the transition that brings Hasley into the new environment, and that family connection reminds the audience that Hasley's life cannot be reduced to romance. Luke's family history similarly reminds the audience that his personality was formed long before Hasley arrived. His father and family circumstances help establish why Luke carries so much emotional baggage. This context is essential because it prevents the audience from viewing his behavior as random. People are shaped by what they experience, and Boulevard wants the audience to understand the emotional origins of Luke's behavior. However, the film also has to avoid suggesting that the past controls everything. Trauma can explain a person's behavior, but it does not have to define the future forever. Luke's challenge is therefore to move from explanation to responsibility. He has to understand what happened to him and then decide what he will do with that understanding. Hasley can help him see the possibility of change, but she cannot make that decision for him. This becomes a recurring emotional pattern in the story. Whenever one character tries to take responsibility for the other, the relationship becomes unstable. Whenever they recognize their individual responsibility while remaining emotionally supportive, the relationship becomes stronger. This distinction is subtle but extremely important. It separates love from rescue. Rescue creates dependence.